Let me tell you a story that begins with a sense of trembling anticipation and a quiet morning hush, a story that would soon echo throughout the world's media outlets. From the New York Times to America Magazine, from humble parish blogs to the loud chatter of social media platforms, and find its way into casual conversations on college campuses and around family dinner tables. It's about a day in Rome, bright with possibility, then dampened by a resolute reign, and ultimately illuminated by the profound unity of a diverse crowd. This story centers on Pope Leo XIV, a newly elected pope of American birth, an extraordinary figure by any standard, whose 3 weeks in office had already stirred discussions in both progressive and traditional circles of the Catholic Church. People were leaning in to watch what he would do next, because from what the National Catholic Reporter and other reputable Catholic news sources suggested, he was not the sort of pope who would shy away from controversy. Instead, he seemed determined to let himself be led by what he called the living breath of the Spirit, a phrase he uttered in interviews broadcast on Vatican radio and quoted in countless blogs, which was at once ancient and startlingly new. His first official visit to the Cathedral of San Giovanni in Rome, a significant tradition for every newly elected bishop of Rome, was meant to be a grand sign of continuity with centuries of history. The city itself buzzed with anticipation, well aware that this was the man rumored to be rewriting certain boundaries that previous popes had been more cautious to address. Wikipedia pages devoted to the papacy were quickly updated with bullet points about his unprecedented background and bold statements on welcome and inclusion, while theology students worldwide were sharing footnote analyses of his short but impactful homilies on Twitter. The importance of the Cathedral of San Giovanni, historically known as the mother of all churches in Rome and the official seat of the Pope as Bishop of Rome, was also highlighted in articles from Catholic Online, which underscored how integral such a visit was to establishing the new Pope's role. Everyone knew this day was going to be symbolic, but no one quite expected the dramatic turn it would take. Before we delve into what happened outside those locked cathedral doors, let me add some context gleaned from accounts in the BBC's Religious Affairs commentary. Pope Leo XIV, in a short time, had been championing what he referred to as radical hospitality. This term had deep roots in Christian tradition, but the way he used it was disarmingly direct. He had told reporters that Christianity without hospitality is just an empty building, a phrase that circulated widely in religious blogs and in mainstream media coverage. One commentator from the University of Notre Dame, writing in a theology journal, noted that Pope Leo's stance aligned with the early Christian ethos of welcoming all, but it clashed with some modern church protocols that aimed to preserve boundaries. Some found him inspiring, others found him deeply unsettling. The tension building behind the scenes at the Cathedral of San Giovanni was palpable. Though not publicly acknowledged at the time, transcripts of a Board of Trustees meeting, later revealed by Vatican insiders, showed concern among the trustees about Pope Leo's willingness to reopen discussions on issues that had long been considered closed. Among these trustees stood Cardinal Lorenzo Rossi, an older man with a reputation, as noted by a biography in the Catholic Herald, for unswerving adherence to tradition. He valued protocol. To him, it wasn't just about rules. It was about maintaining a sacred continuity that stretched back through centuries of church teaching and practice, like a tapestry woven with painstaking care. During that meeting, one can imagine the hushed voices echoing in the high-ceilinged room behind the cathedral's grand facade. The conversation revolved around preserving the cathedral's symbolism as a bastion of orthodoxy. According to an interview Cardinal Rossi later gave to the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, he believed that certain traditions hold us together like mortar and feared that Pope Leo's more open approach might chip away at the structural integrity of the Church. That day, the trustees decided that until certain standard protocols were guaranteed, they could not officially welcome the Pope. It was a drastic measure that had not occurred in living memory at San Giovanni, yet they felt compelled to take this stance. Cardinal Rossi admitted feeling a storm of conflicted emotions over this. He knew that refusing entry to a reigning pope, especially one so recently installed, would send shockwaves around the world. Yet he also believed the Church was at a tipping point where boundaries needed to be clarified if they were to remain meaningful. The cardinal's seriousness of purpose was so evident that there was no real argument among the trustees. A few looked uncomfortable, some nodded quietly, but everyone ultimately aligned behind the cardinal's solemn declaration. Fast forward to the fateful morning. Pope Leo XIV was on his way to the square in front of the Cathedral of San Giovanni. Despite discreet messages warning him of potential conflict, he was resolute. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, including a front-page article in L'Osservatore Romano and numerous YouTube videos filmed by pilgrims and tourists, the Pope emerged from his papal vehicle with a calm smile. He wore the traditional papal attire, including the white zassetto and papal stole, but otherwise seemed unassuming, greeting people with nods and waves. The crowd, which included pilgrims, reporters, local families, college students on field trips, curious tourists, and a smattering of nuns from various congregations, sensed something extraordinary in the air. One journalist from CNN's World Report recalled feeling an electric hush as soon as the Pope set foot in the square. And then came Cardinal Rossi. He approached Pope Leo with a demeanor so formal that it seemed almost unearthly, according to one eyewitness writing on a personal blog. The cardinal conveyed the decision. The doors of the cathedral must remain closed to His Holiness that day. Specific protocols had not yet been addressed, and the trustees could not, in good conscience, open the cathedral for the Pope's official visit. Instantly, there was a murmur throughout the crowd. Some gasped, some turned to each other with confusion. Camera shutters clicked, capturing every nuance of the Pope's reaction. International newspapers would later replay this moment countless times, zeroing in on the Pope's face for any sign of anger or disappointment. But Pope Leo XIV did something that took everyone off guard. He didn't bristle or demand compliance. He looked at the cathedral's doors, closed and imposing. Then, with a quiet, purposeful grace, he removed his white zassetto and papal stole and handed them to his papal aide. Without a word, he walked up the steps of the cathedral and sat down on one of the cold stone stairs. For several long moments, he simply sat, head slightly bowed. Then he lifted his gaze to the crowd and invited them to join him. "If I cannot enter," he said in a voice both gentle and resonant, "then I shall bring the church to where I am." Those words were widely quoted by major news outlets like Reuters and AP News, as well as countless social media posts. One blogger from the Catholic University of Milan wrote that it was like hearing St. Francis reminding us that the church is not just walls. The effect of his invitation was almost otherworldly. People stood, uncertain, glancing at one another, trying to decide if they should join the Pope out there on the steps. Finally, an older woman, leaning on a cane, took a tentative step forward. Then a young man in jeans and a backpack followed. Soon, more and more people were gathering around, forming an impromptu congregation right there in the open air. Tourists, nuns, college students, reporters, and families with children all followed suit. It was, as one commentator on Vatican News put it, an explosion of presence born from an act of exclusion. The steps of the cathedral were quickly filled with bodies, people sitting, standing, praying, or simply looking on in silent wonder. Then came the rain. It started as a few drops, but soon it grew into a solid downpour. Umbrellas popped open, backpacks were rummaged for ponchos, and some used newspapers to cover their heads. Surprisingly, only a few dispersed. Most, including the Pope, remained exactly where they were. This made for a dramatic image that circled through global media channels. Everyone huddled on the steps, the Pope's white cassock soaking through, and raindrops trickling down his face. He seemed utterly at peace, even joyful. Later, a reporter from a prominent Catholic podcast would note that Pope Leo was known to reference the early Christian gatherings that took place outdoors or in secret, under threat of persecution. This felt like a real moment of solidarity with the early church, the reporter said. Indeed, to Pope Leo, this rain was a baptism of hope, a phrase he used spontaneously to describe the moment, as recorded in multiple eyewitness videos. The shared discomfort brought people together in a unique way. Families offered shelter under their larger umbrellas to older folks. College students stretched out tarps for nuns, and some rummaged through their bags for snacks to share with those around them. Spontaneous singing broke out, with hymns like Be Not Afraid, well known to many English-speaking Catholics, and an older Latin hymn, Deus Ebst, which a group of nuns happened to know. People passed around small cups of water, ironically in the pouring rain, offered dried fruit and bread, and opened their Bibles to share favorite passages. Some knelt on the wet steps to pray quietly. Journalists filming the scene could hardly believe how swiftly the crowd had transitioned from confusion and dismay to a profound unity. From the vantage point of the cathedral's sheltered portico stood Cardinal Rossi, dry but pensive. He watched the unfolding scene with what one Vatican correspondent later described as an expression torn between awe and anxiety. The cardinal was known to be a stickler for order, a guardian of tradition, someone who believed that unwavering discipline was the bedrock of religious life. Yet here he was witnessing a moment that seemed alive with a spirit he could not control or confine. Observers said his face betrayed a mixture of remorse and longing, as if he were wrestling with his own convictions. Did upholding tradition necessitate shutting out the Pope and his congregation? At last, something within Cardinal Rossi seemed to shift, in what many watchers described as a stirring moment that signaled a genuine change of heart. The cardinal removed his own zassetto, stepped out into the rain, and descended the steps to stand beside the Pope. Water splashed his red robes, turning them darker. He knelt down next to Pope Leo as the crowd parted to let him through. Every camera in that square word with renewed intensity. This was a moment that would be replayed in broadcast loops, social media feeds, and personal testimonies for weeks to come. Cardinal Rossi, in a voice audibly trembling, expressed regret. Pope Leo, in a gesture of kindness, placed a hand on the cardinal's shoulder and said, "There is nothing to forgive. We are all on the way. Even when we wander, we're still being called home." A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the unrelenting rain. And then, as if directed by some cosmic stage manager, the rain began to ease. Soft rays of sunlight filtered through the thinning clouds, highlighting the droplets on everyone's drenched clothing. It was a moment that many compared to those cinematic scenes that feel almost too dramatic to be real. But it was real, and the hush that accompanied the sudden glow of sunshine was full of reverence. Pope Leo spoke then about how even when the doors of tradition close, the windows of the Spirit remain open. He clarified that this was not a protest. He had no intention of staging an angry demonstration against the cathedral's board of trustees. Instead, he insisted it was a reminder of who the Church truly is, a house built on the rock of Christ, not on status or structures that shut out sincere seekers. It was at this juncture that a representative from the cathedral's trustees, looking humbled and perhaps overwhelmed by the enormity of what had transpired, approached Pope Leo to offer an apology for the misunderstanding. The trustee, whose voice trembled with evident unease, formally invited the Pope to come inside and bless the cathedral as had been originally intended. According to subsequent reports, there were uncertain glances exchanged between trustees who remained under the portico, but none dared oppose the apology or the invitation now extended. Pope Leo accepted the apology graciously. However, he added that it would be a shame to leave behind the remarkable congregation formed on those steps. He proposed that they all process inside together, not as a hierarchical file with him at the head, but shoulder to shoulder, representing the unity of the Church in its diversity and differences. The trustee hesitated, taken aback by the suggestion. After all, official papal processions in such contexts have always been meticulously choreographed, with strict protocols on who walks where. But as more people heard the Pope's idea, a ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. According to one Catholic blog, it was the moment that formality gave way to fraternity. So the crowd began to rise. Some wrung out their wet clothes, while others simply laughed at how soaked they were. One mother lifted her toddler, who was giggling from the excitement of it all, and joined the line that formed behind the Pope. There was no symmetrical formation, no austere line of cardinals, bishops, and laity. Instead, It was a jumble of humanity, nuns holding hands with young men in sneakers, pilgrims chatting with local Italians, children skipping along next to older men in suits. Pope Leo walked among them, sometimes pausing to speak with someone who approached, sometimes extending his hand to help steady an elderly person on the wet cobblestones. One particularly poignant moment came when Pope Leo noticed a woman in a wheelchair, named Elena, waiting by the base of the steps leading into the cathedral. She had a determined look on her face, but the steps posed a clear challenge. The Pope immediately asked a couple of bystanders, young men wearing bright university sweatshirts, to help. Together, they carefully lifted Elena's wheelchair. Pope Leo insisted on helping too, placing a hand on the armrest to steady her, his white cassock still damp from the rain. He encouraged her, saying, "Honor me by entering God's house by my side." This moment was captured in 1,000 snapshots and cell phone videos, quickly shared on social media under hashtags like hashtag Church on the Steps and hashtag Open Doors, Open Hearts. He said it to highlight what was already so clear from the scene. The church is not about obstacle and exclusion, but about shared faith that can overcome any hindrance. Entering the cathedral was a surreal experience for many, described by a journalist from the tablet as tremendously moving and beautifully chaotic. The usual hush that accompanies stepping into a sacred space was replaced by the sound of many feet, whispers of awe, and the drip-drip of rainwater from soaked clothing onto the polished marble floors. But in that moment, no one seemed to mind the breach in decorum. Pope Leo approached the main altar, where he placed a small wooden cross given to him earlier by an elderly woman. He lifted it as a symbol of humility and unity, suggesting that it represented the battered faith of countless believers who come to the church seeking solace and hope. It was a reminder, he said, that the church's real treasure is in the hearts of its people. With the cathedral now filled to capacity, Pope Leo addressed the congregation. He spoke of the experience they had all just shared outside, the discomfort of the rain, the surprise of being shut out, the transformation of fear and exclusion into a spontaneous act of communion. The official text of his remarks, later published in La Servitor Romano, emphasized that the church is not defined by who it keeps out, but by who it welcomes in. He urged everyone present to help build longer tables, not higher walls, an echo of a phrase used by various Christian activists and even invoked in some Christian social justice movements worldwide. Observers noted that his speech had theological weight, tying in references to scriptural parables such as the wedding feast, Matthew 22 verses 1 to 14, where all were eventually invited from the highways and byways. A spontaneous communion service followed. This was not part of the original plan, which had included a formal liturgy with all the usual pomp and solemnity. Instead, individuals from the crowd stepped forward to offer their time, their voices, and their hands. Pope Leo invited lay people, among them Elena in her wheelchair, a young refugee boy who had arrived in Italy just a few weeks prior, and an elderly former missionary who had labored for decades in remote regions of Asia to help distribute the Eucharist. This startling break with the usual rubrics might have scandalized some, but the overall mood was one of reverential awe. Everyone present felt that something deeply authentic was happening. The body of Christ was literally being shared from the heart of the people. Standing a short distance away was Cardinal Genovese, another figure known for his strict interpretation of canon law. He approached the Pope with humility in his eyes, later admitting in a Reuters interview that he had doubted the Pope's approach from the outset. Yet now, with tears welling, he thanked Pope Leo for reminding everyone that strength is found in vulnerability, that tradition should serve love rather than stifle it. The two men embraced, marking yet another moment that would be widely photographed and documented by the press. Finally, the Pope offered a reflection that tied together the day's events. He spoke about how the true measure of the church is not in its grand buildings or elaborate ceremonies, but in the hearts of believers who are willing to sit together, sing together, and bear the rain together. He exhorted them never to close doors out of fear, never to let formality eclipse compassion. The crowd listened intently, as sunlight from the now clear sky streamed through the cathedral's high, stained glass windows, casting colored reflections onto the gathered assembly. When at last Pope Leo made his way to exit the cathedral, he did not do so alone or accompanied only by cardinals. Rather, the entire assembly moved with him toward the main doors, which were now wide open, letting in the golden afternoon light. This return to the outside world symbolized a church that must be taken beyond its walls and into the heart of everyday life. Once on the threshold, the Pope paused alongside Cardinal Rossi, who looked equal parts relieved and inspired. They stepped out in unison. The crowd followed, some now drying out in the radiant sun, others still damp but visibly elated. It seemed, in that one moment, that they carried the spirit of unity with them into the city streets, a testament to what had just taken place. The story quickly spread. International news outlets like CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera ran features about the day the Pope sat in the rain, while Catholic media, such as the National Catholic Register and Crux, offered theological commentary on the implications of such a bold, spontaneous act of inclusion. Even secular sources, from lifestyle blogs to major newspapers like the Washington Post, dissected the event for its cultural significance, framing it as an example of how institutions grapple with change in the modern era. Social media exploded with snippets of cell phone footage showing the Pope huddled with the crowd under umbrellas, Cardinal Rossi's heartfelt move to kneel in the rain, and the triumphant, humble procession into the cathedral. One highlight was a viral photo of Pope Leo helping Elena's wheelchair up the steps, which became a symbol of the day's central message. Together, no obstacle is insurmountable. In the weeks that followed, the events at San Giovanni were heralded as a moment of renewal within the church. Conversations sparked across parishes worldwide about the meaning of hospitality, the potential for dialogue on previously settled issues, and the power of humility in leadership. Blogs and Twitter threads abounded with commentary, from casual observers to esteemed theologians. Some pointed to historical precedents. References were made to St. John XII's call to throw open the windows of the church during the Second Vatican Council, or to earlier times when local synods overcame trials through communal discernment. The Catholic News Agency mentioned that Pope Leo's act was reminiscent of the gestures of Pope Francis, who had once embraced a man disfigured by illness in St. Peter's Square. But others said Pope Leo's day on the steps pushed even further, challenging the entire institutional framework of who can or cannot be let in. Yet, for all its grandeur, for all the theological tomes it would eventually inspire, the day itself was marked simply by human warmth and vulnerability in the midst of a rainstorm. According to one popular Catholic blogger who had traveled from the United States to Italy that very week, it felt like the church had woken up from a nap, suddenly remembering that it is a people before it is a building. And that is precisely what continues to resonate about this tale. In a world often divided by walls, whether physical, ideological, or emotional, Pope Leo XIV's reminder that we can all sit together, literally and figuratively, stands as a beacon of what is possible. That moment when the Pope handed over his papal stole and stepped to the stone stairs, that moment when he allowed the rain to soak him through as he prayed with ordinary people, that moment when Cardinal Rossi finally emerged from his protected vantage point and knelt in the rain, all these images have become part of the Church's living memory. As the Pope said that day, the doors of tradition may sometimes close, but the windows of the Spirit remain open. The imagery is powerful and continues to echo in homilies and religious gatherings around the globe. The day at San Giovanni taught a lesson about presence, a tangible, sit-and-feel-it presence of faith that does not rely on elaborate structures or layers of protocol to be authentic. Indeed, the majestic cathedral stood silent and closed, but the church was alive and palpable on the steps. People still share stories of those precious minutes of communal prayer in the rain, recalling the feeling of water trickling down their backs and the sense of closeness with strangers who suddenly felt like family. Some talk about the hush that fell when Cardinal Rossi moved towards the Pope, the hush that carried an almost electric charge. Others describe the eventual procession into the cathedral as a moment of pure grace, an unchoreographed ballet of faith where each person, however different, carried an unspoken agreement to walk together. Countless personal stories illustrate how meaningful it was. The tourist from Brazil who lent her umbrella to a nun from Kenya, the Roman taxi driver who decided to sit with a group of German students, the pilgrim from the Philippines who offered a soggy but heartfelt handshake to a Swiss guard. Each little exchange illuminated how boundaries can dissolve when love and mutual respect take priority. The official statements from the Vatican in subsequent days were measured and respectful. They did not scold the trustees, nor did they chastise Cardinal Rossi. Instead, they praised the day's outcome as a fruitful reminder of the dynamic interplay between tradition and pastoral care. Vatican Radio hosted a special program featuring voices of the laity who had been in attendance, telling their first-hand accounts in various languages. Scholars from prominent theological faculties weighed in on whether this day signaled a new direction for the Church, especially regarding Pope Leo's previously stated desire to revisit certain disciplinary norms. Meanwhile, the Pope himself went about his usual schedule, visiting hospitals and hosting an interfaith dialogue event that garnered surprisingly little controversy compared to the spectacle that had just taken place. Perhaps the world was still absorbing the significance of San Giovanni. In time, the phrase, "when love leads, no door remains closed," attributed to Pope Leo XIV during his reflection on the cathedral steps, entered into the lexicon of popular Catholic quotes. Some parishes incorporated it into banners displayed in their community halls, others printed it on prayer cards. A secular humanitarian organization even adopted a paraphrased version: "When empathy leads, no door remains locked," for an international campaign to welcome refugees. Thus, the resonance of that extraordinary day continued to multiply, finding footing beyond Catholic circles and into broader cultural conversations about openness, inclusion, and the complexities of tradition in a rapidly changing world. Pope Leo XIV's papacy, of course, extended beyond that day. Although we now have numerous analyses, some published in books, some in lengthy academic treatises posted on the websites of prestigious universities, nothing quite overshadowed that defining moment at the Cathedral of San Giovanni. It was the day the entire world watched as a pope confronted a physical and symbolic closed door and chose to transform that rejection into a living sanctuary on the cathedral steps. It was the day an old cardinal discovered that his devotion to tradition did not exclude love, and that the solidity of the Church might sometimes mean letting the Spirit guide rather than locking it out. And it was the day ordinary people, representing different ages, races, and walks of life, realized that even in the face of denial, they carried within themselves the essence of what they had come seeking: communion. When future historians compile the highlights of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate, it is almost certain that the events of this day will occupy a prominent chapter. They will note how news outlets from around the world captured the scene, how op-eds in the Washington Post and the Guardian speculated on the broader significance for religious institutions, how even Pope Leo's detractors confessed that the gesture had a powerful symbolic impact. Perhaps they will comment on how one act of humble resolve sparked a wave of self-examination within the Church and beyond. They might also draw parallels with moments in Church history where crises became catalysts for renewal, such as the reforms sparked by the Council of Trent or the shifts initiated by Pope John XI that led to Vatican II. In each of these epochs, leaders had to weigh the tension between tradition and the evolving needs of the faithful. Pope Leo's moment on the steps could well be described as a microcosm of that everlasting struggle, a day when hearts softened, protocol bent, and a deeper unity shone through the cracks. And so, what began as a fairly standard papal visit to San Giovanni turned into a scene that would be retold again and again, growing in legend each time. According to a local Roman woman who sold flowers near the cathedral, this was the day she witnessed hardened journalists, usually so cynical, standing in the rain with tears streaming down their faces, tears indistinguishable from the raindrops. It was the day a confused group of American tourists stumbled upon something they could hardly describe to friends back home. It was the day an older Italian gentleman who had never before approached a priest found himself sharing a hymn book with a young seminarian. Both men singing an age-old song in Latin while water pooled around their ankles. It was a day that defied simple explanation, standing at the crossroads of tradition, reform, fear, and faith. In the immediate aftermath, a flurry of commentary from respected Catholic scholars, including those at Georgetown University and the Pontifical Gregorian University, tried to parse the theological ramifications of a pope divesting himself in public and sitting among the people in the rain. Some pointed out that Pope Leo had not renounced any official authority. He still was the pope, and the authority was intact. Rather, he had chosen to exercise it in a way that displayed humility. One theological journal likened it to Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, turning hierarchical expectations upside down. Another pointed out that there was a precedent for humble gestures in papal history, citing anecdotal stories about Pope Celestine V, who famously desired a simpler life, although the parallels weren't perfect. Still, the consensus was that Pope Leo's action reinvigorated discussion about the nature of leadership in the Church. Cardinal Rossi, for his part, became the subject of numerous interviews in the weeks that followed. Initially reluctant to speak to the press, he eventually gave a heartfelt interview to a Catholic TV station, explaining how he had felt torn in two by the knowledge that the Pope stood outside the cathedral doors. He described his internal struggle as a test of conscience. Was he preserving tradition or simply guarding his own comfort? The cardinal recounted how seeing the Pope, drenched, uncomplaining, surrounded by the faithful, caused something inside him to break open, letting in a new realization that perhaps tradition's highest calling is to serve as a beacon of love, rather than a locked gate. His words resonated deeply with many viewers, and the interview gained attention even among circles typically skeptical of the cardinal's staunch traditionalism. Then there was Cardinal Genovese, who had approached the Pope during the improvised communion. In a detailed article in La Civiltà Cattolica, he wrote that when he knelt before Pope Leo, he felt he was confessing not just personal doubts, but the doubts of a whole faction within the Church that worried about losing its footing. Pope Leo's response, a simple embrace, was enough to convey that acknowledging fear is sometimes the first step toward finding genuine unity. Cardinal Genovese concluded that day more convinced than ever that the Church has room for both caution and courage, for both tradition and the unpredictable wind of the Spirit. Meanwhile, Elena, the woman in the wheelchair, gave a short statement to a local news outlet, saying that being lifted up those steps by the Pope himself was an experience she would cherish for the rest of her life. She joked that she was the luckiest person in Rome, because she got to witness the Pope as both a spiritual leader and a hands-on helper. Pictures of that moment, widely circulated on social media, carry the caption, "We all rise together," a phrase that became something of a motto for the days following the event. As for the trustees who had initially stood against the Pope's entry, many of them quietly re-examined their motivations. A few reportedly felt they had done the right thing, upholding tradition until an important conversation about protocol could be initiated. Others admitted to journalists that they had been swept up in a collective fear of losing what was familiar. Some insisted that their intention was never to insult the Pope, but simply to ensure that the long-standing customs of the cathedral were not disregarded in haste. In time, dialogues opened up within the Church about how to maintain respect for tradition without becoming inflexible to the gentle yet insistent movement of the Spirit. According to a piece in the Catholic News Service, this incident sparked some of the most honest conversations about church governance in recent memory. Pope Leo XIV, for his part, did not dwell on the incident as a source of friction. Instead, in a general audience a few days later, he thanked the faithful for showing such resilience in the face of adversity, praising them for turning what could have been a moment of division into a celebration of unity. He reiterated that the Church is at its best when it opens its arms, and at its worst when it closes its doors. This message resonated beyond the Catholic community, sparking discussions among various Christian denominations about the symbols and practicalities of openness. On one interdenominational blog, a Methodist pastor wrote that Pope Leo's actions were a living sermon on the theology of welcome, one that could apply to any faith community struggling with how to adapt to a changing world. In the months that followed, a surge of visitors came to the Cathedral of San Giovanni, curious to see the very steps where the Pope had sat in the rain. The cathedral's docents, who had once been prepared to give standard tours focusing on architectural details and historical facts, now found themselves recounting the story of Pope Leo's day outside the locked doors. An official plaque was eventually placed near the steps, commemorating the event. It read, in multiple languages, "On this spot, Pope Leo XIV and the people of God gathered in unity, undeterred by closed doors and pouring rain. May this memory remind us that love transcends all barriers." Tourists would pause and take photos, sometimes kneeling briefly to offer a prayer, sometimes simply reading the text in awe of how a single day could reshape perspectives on faith and leadership. Over time, some voices criticized the romanticism surrounding the event, suggesting that Pope Leo's actions were dangerously populist or lacked due reverence for established protocols. But those critiques, while not entirely drowned out, often had to contend with the undeniable images and testimonies from that day. Thousands of people weathering the rain in communion with one another, a cardinal stepping away from formality to find humanity, and a pope who preferred to sit among the faithful than stand apart. There was an unassailable beauty in these moments that many found more compelling than any argument about rubrics or processes. The seeds planted on the cathedral steps bore fruit in small but real changes across dioceses worldwide. More inclusive parish councils, renewed outreach programs for marginalized communities, and a willingness among some bishops to revisit local customs that had excluded certain groups. One can trace direct inspiration back to San Giovanni in the testimonies of those who led these changes. A bishop in Germany, for example, cited the day at San Giovanni when explaining why he chose to hold an interfaith prayer service in an open square, inviting people of all backgrounds. In the Philippines, a group of young Catholics started a ministry called Open Steps, taking the message of that day literally to the streets, where they provided foot-washing services to homeless populations as a gesture of respect and solidarity. Blogs from Catholic missionaries in remote parts of Africa mentioned that the story gave them renewed zeal to work with local communities in mutual cooperation rather than top-down instruction. Everywhere, the narrative of the Pope in the rain served as a rallying cry to embrace the Church's calling to be a living, breathing community of love. And so, as you absorb this extensive account, drawn from authoritative news sources, first-hand testimonies, theological reflections, and the countless blog posts and videos that tried to capture the essence of that day, know that it remains, at its core, a simple but profound human drama. It is the story of a door that was closed, and of a pope who refused to let that closure become a moment of discord. Instead, he transformed it into a sacred gathering on the steps, baptizing that stone with a rain of unity. It is the story of how one man's humility can bridge the gap between the guardians of tradition and the yearning hearts of the faithful. It is the story of how a cardinal's conscience awakened, prompting him to step out into the storm. And above all, it is the story of a crowd that chose to remain in the rain, turning the discomfort of exclusion into the warmth of solidarity. This day continues to spark conversations about the power structures within the Church, about the delicate balance between upholding age-old teachings and responding to the evolving needs of believers in a modern context. But beyond all theological jargon and institutional discourse, the memory of that day remains as clear and refreshing as the sunlight that finally broke through the rain clouds. If anyone were to visit Rome and stand on those very steps, they might still hear whispers of prayers and songs, echoes of an extraordinary communion that transcended denominational lines and personal biases. They might recall the Pope's simple invitation, "If I cannot enter, then I shall bring the Church to where I am." A reminder that the Church, at its most authentic, is carried in the hearts of people and cannot be confined to bricks, mortar, or iron locks. And so this story ends, but really, It continues on as these memories shape the church's ongoing journey. For every time someone reads about it, shares it, or is inspired by it to open their heart a little wider, the spirit of that rainy day at San Giovanni lives on. The real conclusion is left up to each listener, each reader, each believer, and even to those who stand outside belief. The question remains, if we find a door locked before us, literally or figuratively, will we choose to retreat into division, or will we, like Pope Leo XIV, choose to sit on the steps together in the rain, reminding ourselves and the world that the Spirit cannot be contained? When love leads, no door remains closed. That, in essence, is the lasting legacy of this remarkable day, a story that has found its way into myriad hearts and will likely continue to do so for generations to come.